Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks so much for coming for PQ Talks. We're continuing our conversation. This morning, we had wonderful panels talking about expanding scenography from the global South perspectives beyond the Western Eurocentric perspectives. And we're continuing with the topic in a way this afternoon. We have this wonderful panel, a local global perspective on Indigenous Materialities of performance. And with that, I want to pass the mic over to Donatella Barbieri, who is the moderator of the panel. Thank you, Donatella.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for scheduling us, and thank you to the wonderful speakers and to you all for being here. I feel it's like a little bit of a historical moment that we should sort of the first time probably that we're foregrounded at Prague Quadrennial First Nations perspective. So yes, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you to that. So even though we might want to talk about this all night, we are under strict instruction. We're going to be kicked out of this room at 6 o'clock on the dot. So I've made myself write everything that I wanted to say very briefly. Because I wanted to introduce the concept of local global a little bit, as it was a little bit controversial when I first mentioned it. So I'm just going to say a couple of words. This many words. So this area is huge. It engages the big questions. What is performance and what does it do for the globe, for the environment, for cultures, for societies and for peoples? How does it sustain and embody the struggle, renew and invigorate cultures when they're under threat? How do specific performances draw us into this big question? And many others. And this is what our wonderful panels will discuss. I'm going to just offer a few snapshots just to situate myself within this conversation in terms of the idea of local global, myself being Italian, living in Britain, and really being renewed every time I come to this fabulous festival. So if I can have the first slide of mine, please. Thank you. So so this is my local museum. This is local to where I live in London. It holds these masks and more as a result of the British Empire colonizers' curiosity. On encountering them, they are alive through their material presence. For their rightful owners, they embody material and immaterial connections to the land, stories and ancestors. Where do we go from here? That is my question that they ask me. Can we have a second slide? Oh, I can do this actually. Oh, okay. That's it. It works, sorry. So local to my Italian culture, the Mamutones are at the core of the marginalized Sardu culture from the island of Sardinia, colonized by the ancient Romans, 2,000 years and more ago. And their culture lives on in Sardu language and in these processional performances that yearly transform the space in an interspecies landscape. What do I point to? Sorry. Next one, please. Thank you. So what was really interesting a few years ago is that the Sardo theatre maker, Serra, here, this is his work, from a Sardo community, the elemental quality that he brought to this physical production of Macbeth were revelatory. He stripped back the story to the rawness of its essence and took a local story, became a local story that resonates in festivals around Europe. Next slide, please. So festivals that do like this one nurture local expressions. The Origins Festival in the UK, which is run by Michael Walling, platform First Nation artists such as I will probably mispronounce this, so apologies, the Voladores da Papantla, if somebody else there knows what I'm talking about, which is an ancient ceremony performed by the Totonac men to encourage fertility. And the flight connects heaven and earth. Next slide, please. So back to the museum. Pacifica artist, Can't see her, sorry. It's Rosanna Raymond. Pacifica artist Rosanna Raymond from Aotearoa in New Zealand. Apologies for mispronouncing that as well, because I'm, unfortunately, Western perspective, always read things and never speak them. Was involved in the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology to curate an exhibition. She just was involved in curating an exhibition, but she transformed it into a festival in 2008 that took over the city of Cambridge. And that's when I look at those objects in the museum, that's what I think sometimes. We need a festival about them and what they bring with them and the whole of the contemporary resonances that exist. So we will learn much through the local and global manifestation that our wonderful speakers bring today to the festival, about timelessness and about being timely, about survival and about celebrations, about materiality and immateriality, about struggle and renewal, and much more. Okay, so first we're going to look at a film by Amethyst First Rider, who is not able to be with us. She is a First Nation Canadian from the Blackfoot. I will talk about her in a minute, I'll introduce her. And this is her Any Skin project. Those of you who were a world stage design were able to experience this live. And she co-produced it. The reason why I wanted her to be here, we wanted her to be here, is because that project was boosted by this festival 4 years ago, by the encounters of some of the collaborators that you will see on the video. She will be followed by Lily Montero, and her translator, you'll introduce everybody later. And then Fausto Viana, who you all know. And then we will have two films by Deepsika. I haven't got the list, but doesn't matter. By Deepsika Chatterjee from New York in India, and Babatunde Bakari from Yorubaland in Nigeria. The joint presentation, the pièce de résistance of today, and we were all really proud to have these amazing humans here, is the joint presentation will be led by curator of the Australian exhibition, designer Jacob Nash, who will present with Wesley Enoch, the playwright, director, Sydney Festival art director, and with Stephen Page, choreographer and artistic director for the 3 decades of the incredible Bangara dance company. And they will conclude the presentations. We're going to try to eke out some questions at the end, but we will be kicked out at 6 o'clock, so but we should have enough time for questions. So we now, if we can move towards presenting the next video, please, which is the performance. Yeah. I'll say a few words.
We're storytellers, and that's what we do.
It's a celebration of the buffalo.
Dance the buffalo back to the land. Dance back the buffalo. Okay, apiska.
I grew up listening to my grandparents' stories and hearing these Napi stories and how our buffalo were hid. It's really beautiful for me to see, celebrate the homecoming of them.
When we got the buffalo in Banff and we secured them and they were on the land, and we had many prayers from community people, from our elders, we celebrated them. We thought this would be a wonderful celebration for the community to come out and join in a festive activity with the buffalo. The presentation is about a very old traditional Blackfoot story. And in Blackfoot territory, we have a person, a spirit by the name of Napi, and Napi is our trickster. And as one of the adventures of Napi hid the buffalo in the mountains, and the people were starving because the Napi had hid the buffalo in the mountains. And so really it's a story about how we get the buffalo back out of the mountains and celebrate.
It's a story of hope and a story of resiliency and resurgence, but it also has tragedy to it. And the buffalo, they met a very tragic circumstance, but it was not their end. And that's what we celebrate, is that their numbers are growing and they're coming back. The audience congregates in an area and they receive lanterns, and then they're led through the environment, and they go through the forest where they witness a static garden of lanterns, and there's voices in the trees, a choir singing earth sounds. And then you emerge out of that and you see the mother buffalo and the baby buffalo, and then you meet Napi, the Blackfoot trickster, who tells the story of the buffalo.
The puppets are such a beautiful way of capturing the energy of the land, of the night, of the light. And in Blackfoot, the word Napi, or trickster, Abi describes a beautiful white light that describes the energy. And so what we're capturing is the energy of Napi, but also the energy of the land.
They're interesting things. Lanterns are universal, and we're drawn to the light of the lantern because it glows. It's not a harsh white light. It's an emanating glow. And I think that all human beings have sort of an instinctive journey to connect to that kind of light. One of the things that's beautiful about the experience is that we also reunite with our relationship to darkness and the night, because nobody gets to use a flashlight, and everybody's eyes adjust to the light of the night as opposed to the darkness of the night, and you can see as you go. And it is an experience of becoming more complete. And in a time actually when we feel like we're all getting shattered and fragmented and separated, to discover that there is, a wholeness that can come from the environment is pretty exciting.
It's really a celebration of a very holistic, traditional, from our point of view, a very native point of view. We're celebrating the stars, we're celebrating the beautiful land, and we celebrate the water people. So it's a very holistic look at buffalo and the land and Blackfoot territory.
The buffalo really took care of us, and that was our source of life and what sustained us, all of us, our food, our shelter, our ceremonies. And so to welcome them back to their home, where they belong and where they once were, it's really beautiful to see that, and to see that story told in such a beautiful way.
It's such an honor for us to be able to do this presentation in Canada. Because of our Truth and Reconciliation, this performance is also part of our reconciliation with Canada. But it's our story, it's Canada's story. And it's such a privilege to be able to do this show with my granddaughter and to hear another generation speak of relationships within all of Canada. Janelle?
Thank you so much. That was, thank you for Amethyst. I will pass it on to her. So just to say that the real buffalo actually comes back. They actually, I think what Leroy Little Bear said is that they actually airlifted them into the fields and put tobacco out so that they could find themselves a smoke. But apparently the buffalo really loves tobacco, so that's begun to be a real big part of their real life. So now we have Lily, if you want to take over. I don't know if you want to sit down somewhere and be together. And Fausto, Professor Fausto Viana from São Paulo University, and Lily Monteiro from, do you want to say a few words? Teatro de Vertigines, thank you. So take it over.
Well, I guess all of you noticed I'm not Lily Monteiro, right? I'll be just helping Lily, I'll be translating, right? So I beg for patience. Okay.
Boa tarde.
Well, good afternoon.
Eu sou descendente de indígena.
I'm a descendant from the indigenous people.
Minha avó, mãe do meu pai, era uma mulher indígena.
My grandmother, the mother of my father.
Do pai.
Okay. The mother of her father was an indigenous woman,
e ela casou
and she got married
com um homem branco
with a white man
em 1920.
in the 1920s.
Apesar de serem pessoas muito pobres,
Even though they were very poor,
tinha um preconceito muito grande do branco casar com uma indígena.
okay, it was very rare. They had very preconceived ideas of a wedding of white people and an indigenous woman.
Com isso, o meu avô, casando com a minha avó, ele apanhava tocaia. Ele apanhava o tempo, muitas vezes, da família dele.
Okay, so her grandfather, because he married her, he was always trapped in the city and he was beaten by the family, by his own family.
E isso foi distanciando meu avô, quando meu pai tinha 7 anos.
And her grandfather, and she's talking about her father now, when her father was 7,
Meu avô se matou
her grandfather suicided
na frente da família toda.
in front of the whole family.
A partir desse momento, meu pai assume a família do meu avô.
From that moment on, her father assumed the family of her grandfather.
Então a história era sempre muito trabalhar o tempo todo para a família deles ter sustento.
So the story was they should work all the time so that their family could make it, could make a living.
A minha avó, indígena, nunca tirou foto.
Her grandmother, who was an indigenous woman, never took a picture.
Essa questão indígena, por conta desse preconceito, ela foi ficando muito distante da minha família.
Because of this, of all the preconceived ideas, all those matters that involved indigenous roots were set apart from the family.
Então, eu sou uma descendente de indígena
I'm an indigenous descendant,
completamente colonizada.
completely colonized.
Em 2004,
In 2004,
o Teatro da Vertigem
the Teatro da Vertigem
foi fazer uma experiência, uma pesquisa de campo até o Acre.
they went on field research up to Acre in the north of Brazil.
E nós fomos de ônibus,
And they went by bus,
parando de cidade em cidade, de estado em estado.
going from city to city, from state to state, and I can guarantee that's very far.
É muito longe,
It's very far.
porque saímos de São Paulo.
Because they left from São Paulo, which is down there in the south.
Bem, chegando no Acre, nós experimentamos várias, como era uma pesquisa de campo, experimentamos várias coisas, assim, várias comidas, várias bebidas.
When they reached Acre, they went on trying different food, different drinks,
E também experimentamos ayahuasca.
and they took ayahuasca. Who said wow?
Foi impressionante a experiência para mim.
The experience for her by drinking ayahuasca was impressive.
Eu comecei a sentir verdadeiramente no meu corpo o despertar da floresta, da minha ancestralidade.
She started to feel in her body the awakening of her ancestry.
Nesse tempo, em São Paulo, no começo, não era fácil achar ayahuasca, encontrar ayahuasca.
So during this time in São Paulo, it wasn't easy to find ayahuasca.
Mas a memória celular e ancestral minha começava a brotar.
But her ancestral cell memory began to blossom.
Eu comecei a me aprofundar cada vez mais na cultura, né, na cultura indígena.
She started to study the indigenous culture.
E agora eu vou dar um salto no tempo, tá?
And now she's going to have a leaping time. There's a word for it, a time warp. She's going to do a time warp. That's what she said, really. Yeah.
Em 2019, agosto de 2019,
So in August 2019,
São Paulo virou noite às 3 da tarde.
São Paulo in 2019, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it became night.
E foi muito de repente.
And it was all of a sudden.
Quando a gente descobriu o que era, porque começou as redes sociais falando e depois reportagens,
Because when we found out what it was that had made night in São Paulo at 3 o'clock, because the social media was talking about it and everything else,
descobrimos que por conta de uma frente fria, um vento que bateu diferente, toda a fuligem das queimadas da Amazônia, da floresta amazônica, ela foi varrida para São Paulo.
Okay, Portuguese speakers, help. What she's saying is that all the ashes from the Amazon burning were brought to São Paulo by the wind. So mind you, we're talking about 4,000 kilometers, right? Did you get it? Okay. So that's why it was night in São Paulo, people.
Foi um impacto tão grande para mim, porque para mim a floresta estava pedindo socorro.
She said it had a very strong impact on her because she noticed the forest was asking for help.
Porque São Paulo, todas as coisas que acontecem em São Paulo, elas têm maior visibilidade, pelo menos no Brasil.
Because everything that happens in São Paulo things have more visibility than in the rest of the country.
E esse pedido de socorro, ele me pegou tão forte que eu comecei a pensar como ajudá-la.
And this beg for help got her so strongly that she started to think, how can I help the forest?
E aí que me veio a ideia, lendo... Vou passar o filme que talvez ilustre um pouco do que eu estou falando.
So she's going to show a piece of a video that will illustrate what she's trying to say. Leandro is asking me to tell you that this idea created the performance that is happening now in Prague that is called Forestania.
Thank you very much, Lily. That was beautiful. Sad and beautiful. So, Professor.
We still have 5 minutes, right?
Yes. Are you going to present?
We're in a hurry.
You can present.
Will I continue now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So now we have Fausto, and he's going to talk about a very special project that is also set in the Amazon forest.
Well, it's hard to talk about anything after these images, right? But okay. So I'll be talking to you today about the costumes of The Future is Ancestral, right? That's a performance on the roof of the United Nations with DJ Alok. Do you know this man? No, never heard it. Talk to me, people, come on. I'm a teacher, right? I'm a teacher. So there's only one thing teachers need, love. Really, really. I can guarantee that, right? So talk to me, please, okay? Okay, so DJ Alok, that is a very wealthy man. He got these ethnies, right? The Huni Queen, the Iawanawa group, and Owera MC. So you see what I'm talking about. Who should I look at to say, let's go on? You or you? Who am I talking to? You? Okay, so let's go. Yeah, because Donatella said she's going to kill me if I... Okay, so this is myself, and I want to thank FAPESP, right, people? FAPESP, those people who pay for us to be here, we have to thank them. Let's go. Okay, this is DJ Alok, right? Alok, people, he's 31 now, and his name in Sanskrit means light, right? And his parents are DJs too, right? He looks great, come on. Let's go. Guys. Okay, so Spotify, Alok concentrates more than 20 million monthly listeners, right? And 5 billion streams. He performs 320 shows in 5 continents yearly. I'm sure you know them. How am I to handle this and this and... Okay, this is gonna be fun. I'm gonna point this here, right? Okay, Jesus. So, are you sure you don't know this? Oh, can't you hear me now? Right, that's it, right? So 2 years ago, he set this institute, right, for projects in Brazil, Africa, and India, right? He has donated more than $10 million to social and environmental projects. And this is the show. The Future is Ancestral. It was a performance on the rooftop of the United Nations alongside with this Indigenous, right? So this is Mapuhuni Queen. We're not talking about him today. And this is Owera MC. This man is from the ethnic Guarani, right? And he's from São Paulo. Yes, we have indigenous people in São Paulo too. Okay? And finally, the Iawanawas, right? So who are these people, right? These guys around him are Iawanawas. And then when I saw this show, I said, who was this designer? Right? What are those costumes? And this is our point here. How can we dress indigenous people in performances? And then you are going to tell me who was the costume designer at the end, right? Okay, do we have disagreement? Okay, so there they are. Iawanawas, right? They live in the north. Remember that we were talking about Acre. So the red ball is showing Acre, right? It's in the north of Brazil, okay? And they don't speak their language anymore because when the Catholic priests went to Brazil to colonize, what did they do? They forbid Portuguese. No, oh, I'm sorry. They forbid their original languages. They couldn't speak original languages. They could only speak Portuguese. They couldn't wear their own costumes because it was forbidden by the religion. But then again, what is their original costume, right? And how would they perform? So this again is the group, right? And then when I saw this Apache, Maya, Inca look, I said, who was the costume designer, right? Okay, so here's what my first thought was. So these are native people from Cusco in Peru, who's like a close country, right? Over there. And then there are other tribes in Brazil. These are the Ashaninkas, for example, and they wear tunics, but nothing similar to those things that they were wearing in the show. Nothing related, right? Okay, so then I got this book. This was published by the Iawanawa. It's called The Plan of Life, Iawanawa, right? And then Raimundo Salles Iawanawa, an elderly of the tribe, said, what my grandparents told me was that before the contact with the white man, our type of life was really primitive. He said that, not me, okay? No clothes. Women would wear only those small tangas, and men were naked, just tying an envira to their genitals. Just in case you're interested to know how to tie a genital with an envira, I'm going to show you. So this is the tanga, right? Okay? People, last time we were presenting in Calgary, I know it sounded like pornographic, but pornography is in the eye of the beholder, right? It's not pornography for them. This is their costume. Okay? So these two indigenous people were recently in touch with the white communities. Mind you, 2014, for the first time, right? Naturally, they almost died, right? They had to be vaccinated and so on because they contacted white people. And vira is that thing tying in their waists, right? Okay, Hamilton Matos, I went to talk to this man who is a teacher and an anthropologist in Acre, a white man, okay? And then I said, listen, what is happening? And then he explained, first of all, they couldn't wear their costumes, they had to speak Portuguese, right? And what happened? Their costumes disappeared completely up to the 1980s, right? In the 1980s, they were offered their own land, something that is happening in Canada right now, giving back land to the indigenous people, right? So then they had a new way of dressing. They didn't know how to speak their languages. They didn't know how to sing their songs. So in the 1980s, what did they do? They sent one of their youngsters to the United States to study marketing. Right? So they needed to survive. They had to find a way out, okay? So they sent this man to the United States, and now they have this Iawanawa festival, right? So if you feel like taking ayahuasca, or dancing with them, or eating their food, or even going through shamanic rituals, join them, right? So, so there is the authentic Iawanawa. Right? Naturally a white man, right? But then you say, Fausto, is this authentic? Anthropologists say there's nothing authentic when you're relating to indigenous people, especially in Brazil, right? Why? Because they absorb what you offer them, okay? So he said we can't use the word authentic, right? And then they're what is the pronunciation again? Entrepreneurs. Right? They even have a shamanic initiation. I mean, if you go to the web, you can join them in their next ceremony, right? So this is the costumes that they wear in the rituals, okay? Listen, they even have, there's a very famous company in Brazil called Farm, and they're producing panties with indigenous prints with the indigenous women, right? So he said that getting distant and getting closer, devouring and being devoured is part of the indigenous system, right? Hamilton said that in this case, they had been devoured, right? It's his opinion. But my question here to you and to myself all the time, that they were devoured, but from the point of view of artistic creation, they brought together elements from various cultures, although the term is difficult to define, the term culture, right? They had Apache, they had Maya, Inca, other Brazilian ethnicities in favor of an artistic creation that was integrated into the proposal of the event, the performance and the project, The Future is Ancestral of the Alok Institute. And this is the question. It's not a statement, it's a question, right? Artistic freedom is a prerogative of the costume designer, whether they are indigenous or not, right? And then my final question, who designed the costumes? Guess who? The indigenous themselves. Right? It was not a lock, not his team. There was no money. The indigenous themselves. How do I know that? I interviewed all of them, right? And all of them said the same. No, it's our creation. They also said, if you want to buy some, I'll send them to you. Okay? Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Fausto. I think there's a whole, there's so much there that we could unpack in terms of what costume is and what it does and how it connects to all sorts of complex issues, etc. So, I mean, I think that is really amazing in 7 minutes to have been able to pack, yes, to pack that really complex subject. So shall we move on to Deepsika? Deepsika introduces herself, so we can just roll on with a film, which she's just finished her PhD. I'm sort of hoping that, I know that this is a little bit, we are practitioners, but I'm hoping that people understand that doing a PhD is a really good way to further knowledge in aspects of cultures that are not really known, and they've been oppressed, and they have not been known before. So she's doing quite a lot to promote this part of her culture.
Hello, everyone. I'm Deepshika Chatterjee, joining you from New York, New Jersey, the original Lenni Lenape land today. I am from India and have lived in the US for 20 years. The findings of this presentation are based on 4 case studies of mass traditional performance from South Asia. I just completed my PhD defense from CUNY Graduate Center on this topic. Purulia Cho, on the extreme left, Saraikela Cho, second left, Bhavna, second right, are from eastern India, while Bhairav Nach is from Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. The genres all have active practice at this time with significant community support. They're valuable in their design process, engineering, structural elements, crafting, and in the use of natural available resources, creating spectacular stage effects. Traditional mass performances, often seen in Global South, are maintained by indigenous communities. Beyond my examples, we see this in Gelede in Africa, among indigenous practices in Mexico, in Tovil from Sri Lanka, in Cirebon in Java, and in Bali, and in No of Japan. In South Asia, with centuries of immigration, Tanga and Subba and Eric Carlson, in their book Indigeneity in India, state how internationally they are recognized, the indigenous are recognized with 3 points: as original inhabitants, as descendants of original peoples, and in contemporary settings as non-dominant people with a culture different from the majority, drawing from the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In my research, Purulia Cho region is the truly indigenous community supporting the performance genres, where Santhal, Orao, Munda, and the Dome communities are original practitioners. Ronald Meejan defines these communities as systematically maligned or suppressed. They all have strong religious anchors, where religion, rituals, festivity, and everyday life intersect. God Vishnu-centric practice in Bhavna, a tradition of indigeneity and socio-political conditions in Purulia and Saraikela Cho, and secretive tantric ritual practice from Buddhist and Hindu Hindu practices in Nepal's Bhairav Nach have shaped the genres. They all used handmade, one-of-a-kind masks and costumes. There are a series of rituals here that are that play a reiterative function. The locations of these genres on the fringe also played a role in continuity, often shielding from colonization and playing a cocooning effect. Time here is often understood through agrarian and season-based calendars, reinforcing a predictability and a ritual responsibility and festivity. Specific castes or guthis in Nepal are assigned to maintain the traditions. In India, they're often under subgroups of castes. In pretty much all of these cases, it is only male performers who continue the traditions. Women were discouraged from artistic and ritual practice often, but they have made a little bit of space for themselves. One of the positives of such a close-knit system of practice is that boys get exposure from an early age, and they pick up codified movement in low-stakes manner. Because of the geographical space on the fringe, the community is often close-knit with music, movement, and masking operating in proximity. And often these genres have to be studied with a study of all of the artistic practices around them together. So in an interdisciplinary manner. For example, how are costumes stored or how are costumes worn and handled by crew members? Because of artistic space, access to artistic space, the artists have an ability to learn in a very close-knit manner and have access to nature-based materials such as clay from the riverbank, wood, bamboo from the yard, cow dung from domesticated cows, all allowing for access to low-cost or no-cost materials, what we now call as eco-scenography. The genres are all practiced such that they provide efficacy for the community and as offering of material and scenographic content for the community as well as for ritual and religious purposes and as entertainment for locals and outsiders. I call all of these the umbrella of tradition. Let's look at one example further along. And you can see in all of these materials that are used, that they're using local flour from their kitchen or cotton from the local market or clay from the backyard, materials that have deep connections for these people. And how are they worn is also an important factor in these genres. Okay, let's take a look at this video. So this is Nepal's Mahakali Pakhyan, and you get a sense of how the community comes together for the performances. And what my study reveals is that on the surface, mass performances externalize and materialize what we fear, but they also serve as systems of fulfillment and reasons for festivity. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. I will pass on your... Thank you. And last but not least, before we go to the three critical people that we are all here to listen to and respond to now, I just want to briefly look at Babatunde Alam Bakari, who also looked at costume as part of his studies of dramaturgy and of how in his study if we look at Babatunde's video, because I think I will be speaking over it. He asked me to speak over it. I second authored an article that Babatunde's video. If you turn it down a little bit, because I can speak over it, yeah. So Babatunde asked me to speak over it. I second authored an article on costume for studies in costume and performance with him just recently. And we're sort of collaborating because he came to costume as a way of addressing those really big issues that we were discussing at the beginning of what is performance for, etc. And he demonstrated to us that in his initial talk at Critical Costume in 2020, that these costumes were absolutely essential to the well-being of the community, and the performances were at the root of well-being. And his dissatisfaction was that the young people were into hip-hop, and they were not into this. So he's here doing a workshop with his students. So the gangan, the wearer of the beaded costume, the big beaded costume in the corner, is an ancestor. As far as you're concerned, he's an ancestor. He's there in front of you as an ancestor. And it can only be treated in a certain way. The drumming is implied in that. The dancing and the drumming are part of everyday life for the community for this Yoruba community, but also for the whole of Africa. You breathe and you dance, and you talk and you dance. So they improvise this work around this Igangan reenactment. He called it a reenactment, but what it is the wearer can only be a certain wearer. He is the older of a family Igangan costume. So the family holds a costume, owns the costume, passes it on generation. So he's literally living the ancestor as wearing the ancestors. And he is, in that moment, it could be in the real life of the society, it could be mediating quarrels. It could be resolving issues that have to do with the group that is there, but as well as ensuring the well-being, the well-being of the community. So it really goes back to that question of what is performance for, and how does it address our well-being as human being in this world, in contact with the ancestors, in contact with the environment, relationally, and we're going to hear much more in a minute. But what I was going to just say about this is that another researcher that I have met that is researching this area, she said when she was in Yoruba land, an Igangan came out. They're part of the family situation, the family and communal and shared performances. The Igangan came passing the street, and this woman in a completely perfect sort of modern suit and high-heeled shoes prostrated herself on the floor immediately, a little bit, because that's what you do. That's what you do. You see an Igangan, there's a certain code of practice that you do. Have we finished it? Yes. Are we at the end of it? Or how much? Sorry? Oh, okay, 1.5 minutes. I just thought. Yes, I can see the prostration is something that you do, but then the wearer of that is a fellow student. But when he comes out of that costume, he's a fellow student. When he's wearing that costume, he's the ancestor, effectively. And it is the costume. The costume has got 2 layers. One layer that is woven of textiles that are grown from the land of the community, which is internal, and the external, it's collected from various fabrics from all over the world and traded into the space. So it's almost like a layer that roots you into the place. There's a place that roots you into the place of your existence, and something that connects you to the whole world through the fabric, which is quite an interesting way of accepting it. What's interesting is that he's arguing for not hip-hop, but he's arguing for this instead of hip-hop. But I think that we can probably see a way of bringing the 2 things together. Some of us, maybe Stephen can say something about, but we can see ways in which hip-hop and this are not that distant in a certain way. They create communities and they create certain ways of being. So going back to what this possibility of costume and performance to navigate different ways of existing. So this is from, thank you. And now, without further ado, we hand over to Jake, who's going to lead the Jacob Nash, who is the curator of the Australian exhibition, and he's going to take it away.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see you all here today, and thanks for coming to this talk. As a First Nations man of Australia, you know, when you come to another country, you not only have to acknowledge the country that we're on, but also acknowledge my ancestors and the country that I come from. And that is customary. That's how we connect home, and that's how we connect internationally. So I acknowledge where we are, I acknowledge my people, Daly River people, my mother's country. I acknowledge other First Nations people here today and other speakers who have shared their stories as well. I might grab that clicker and I will... The clicker? Thank you. And I'll introduce these two wonderful men who have come to join me in this conversation today. Stephen Page. And Wesley Enoch. Three couches, one couch. And I think, you know, before we kind of kick into it, my connection to these men is we are brothers now, we are family, we are clan, directors, storytellers, designers, and that is how, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we relate to ourselves, particularly in this contemporary world of telling stories. And I met Stephen, I think we worked it out 17 years ago, approximately, and I'd seen a show at Bangarra Dance Theatre, and it blew my mind because all of a sudden it was connecting for me to something I didn't grow up with. I didn't grow up with culture, and I didn't grow up in my country. And that's part of the history of Australia as a colonised nation. And I think this talk, we have to talk about a bit of this stuff up front so you can then understand what design is for a First Nations man, for First Nation storytellers, because it puts all the pieces together. You can't just jump straight into a show and go, oh, there's an image, it talks about this, because it doesn't talk about the backstory. It'll put it into context. So the image you see behind me is a really important image, and for many of you might not have seen it, but it talks to the many clans and language groups that we have in Australia. If you look at the contemporary map since colonisation, it obviously doesn't look like that. It got carved up and there's 5 states and 1 territory, I think, or 6 states. Doesn't look like that. But that talks to how we're connected. That talks to our kinship system. And you see that on the top, just to the left, there's a circle, and that's my country. That's my mother's country. And then we look down and we get to that halfway down the east coast of Australia, we get to where these two men's country and families are from. And I might get you both to just talk about your families and how you are connected, and then we'll continue on.
Well, I come from Quandamooka people. We're on Strathrock Island, Minjirrabah, which is a sand island. And in fact, Stephen and I share a great-great-grandparent in the way that we're cousins. And just to say too that one of the things that are very important about that island is that it is a home of both an artistic and cultural movement, but also a strong political movement, that art and politics kind of match in many ways as well. There's a situation like, so yes, I'm a theatre maker by trade and my sister is the arts minister. That politics and art go hand in hand from a First Nations perspective, that you can't have art without the sense of the political voice from place as well. So Stephen and I come from that long tradition of telling stories and making change.
Thank you. Turn it on. That's right. Thank you, my cousin Wesley. I'm a Quandamooka Nation, Yugambeh Nation, freshwater, saltwater man from this. Wesley, my mother's side, and is connected to Wesley's family. And I too just want to acknowledge being on this country and thank Jake for He only told me 2 days ago I was coming here, so no, I'm only joking. Had no idea what I was doing. I was just feeding him stories, and then next minute he went off and designed. But yeah, my father's a freshwater man from Yugambeh Nation. There's 5 clans within the Yugambeh Nation in that area, and he's one of the smaller clans, the Malanjali clans. I've worked with Jake, as Jake said, 70 years ago. I've known Wesley since we were little, and we had to go to church together, and Wesley wouldn't sing those Christian songs, and I used to... No, I'm only joking. I'm really jet lagged and tired, sorry. As Wesley said, we move as a mob, we birthed as a mob, we are displaced as a mob, especially in the southern part of our country. I know for generations and generations of my mob, my mum and dad's mob, it's been always about hanging on by that resilient little thread of resilience to always know where you come from. And my grandfather on my mother's side is Irishman, and I curse him all the time because I am the fairest of all my brothers and sisters. And I was curious from a very young age about why I wasn't black enough. And I end up being the one that sort of led in my family to be obsessed with reconnecting, rejuvenating art and culture and story. And I'm so glad I did, because it's given me a voice, it's given me a responsibility in my family and clan to continue our stories, to make it a better place for generations to follow. 12 kids in my family, 6 girls, 6 boys. All my sisters are still alive, bless them. They're from, 65 to 74. They're all great-grandmothers. There's 140. My granddaughter was the 140th grandchild in our family, and I think it's just unbelievable to think that still exists in today's society. So that just goes to show that I come from a big mob. I was director of Bangarra Dance Theatre, one of the only... Probably...
We're going to get to this.
We're going to get to this minute. See, Jake, I said it's really bad getting me up here and talk. Anyway, Gumbaloo, Jumbaloo, Jaradu.
Yeah, I think I've just become their brother's little brother. I met Wes too, I didn't say before. Probably a little bit after Stephen, but I guess they both gave me an opportunity as a designer to jump in and start having really good conversation about what First Nation design is. There really isn't many First Nation designers in Australia. I did study at NIDA, so I had that education, but over the last 15 years, I've also unpicked that completely, that education, because it doesn't... I use it as a tool, to be able to create shows that live in a Western theatre space, but I bring it always back to culture and who we are and the stories that we want to tell as First Nation people. And I guess there's a couple of things, just reflecting on listening today about what's been said, is that culture's always living. It's never still, it's continuing forever. And the other thing is that, we as Aboriginal people, our connection to place goes back a really long time, like 65,000 years of continuation of culture, and that is really important. And it's made me think, actually, recently that, everybody looks at Australia as the bottom of the world, but actually I think we're the centre of the cultural universe. And I think that's a really kind of important way for us to think about how our place in the world, our cultural responsibilities in the world, how we tell stories. And that leads on to this point too about, as artists, we don't choose, and you both said it, we don't choose, this isn't decoration to our lives, this is our lives. We are storytellers because we are keepers of story, we are keepers of knowledge, and that's what we do, that's our fate in life. And that informs everything we do. And it brings up, I guess, the next slide, and I took that photo, and it talks to the exhibition over there. That's Bodine Riley-Smith, Wiradjuri man, also who played Bennelong, and we're going to talk about Bennelong, the show, in a minute. But I also just wanted to talk a little bit about Bangarra and also about process, just design process about how we get from A to B. Do you want a quick rundown on Bangarra, Stephen, or Wes?
Oh God, have you got 65,000 years?
Yeah.
This takes a long time. Just quickly, Bangarra is a performing arts dance theatre company established in 1989. It's probably 34 years now, if you calculate that right. 34 years of 65,000. It was a contemporary company that was set up professionally to maintain and keep and look after traditions, inspired stories, care for them in this contemporary space and world we live today. My time there was 32 years as artistic director and as choreographer. We had clans of artists from scenic to lighting to costume, full-time dancers. It was established by a clan of brothers and sisters from all walks of life, of diversity of First Nations mob in Australia who had the vision and the passion to establish a storytelling foundation. Anyway, we all got together and it's still surviving. It fights and it wrestles with the federal and the Commonwealth systems of sustaining First Nations story grounds to keep continuing and to be supported. It's distinctively one of the probably one of the most distinctives in the world in terms of a foundation that holds stories. And Jake was sniffing around outside the fence and...
Yeah, I was. I was.
And I said, where are you from? What's your mob? What's your totem? And...
He invited me in and I answered phones and in the front desk.
He had to work downstairs and make tea and coffee and do all that and go bush hunting and look for honey and go and get some pippies and then... Anyway, he ended up creating works and he, And then obviously with Wesley, it's the same thing. Wesley was doing the same on the other side and working in theatre and...
Now I'm stuck in the middle with them both.
Yeah.
Can I just add to this the idea that Bangarra does this wonderful thing where looking at ceremony, the continuity of ceremony and performance from outside of the ethnographic and the anthropological, it actually brings a lot of that idea of ceremony and performance into the contemporary world. And that even some of the conversation we've had already today, which looks at a very ethnographic lens of what is sometimes a museum view of what is a First Nations cultural perspective, that the work that Stephen's done and also Jake's done has been looking at bringing that conversation into the present day, which empowers First Nations people to create their own iconography, their own sense of being in the world as contemporary people. And I go back to Fausto's question, who was the designer of that work, of the costumes? It has to be a First Nations person. It cannot be, as part of a colonial project, a group of white people telling Indigenous Australians or Indigenous people what is right and what is wrong. We get to decide that. We empower ourselves in that process. And it's not something that others get to say what is right or wrong, what fits in the museum view that's been created by a white context, and what is authentic. And those words, I think, which have been challenged already tonight. And this idea that what I think Stephen and Bangarra represents is a cultural progression, unended, uninterrupted, that has kind of dealt with contemporary life and modernity and brings First Nations perspectives into the present day for everyone to consume and understand. And that's something we need to consider all the time about when you put First Nations people in charge of the discussion, in charge of the design, in charge of things, though they may not fit into what is an ethnographic or anthropological frame that you think is right, it is right because we get to make that decision, which is what I think Fausto's point was, that we get to decide what that looks like from our perspectives.
Yeah, that's it. And it's about space being made, and then when that space is made, being able to take control of it and own it. And that, I think, the wonderful thing about my relationship with Bangarra is that I just finished up there last year as head of design. which was 12 years long. And it's sort of funny, I was making a joke about answering phones and packing trucks, but actually it's the best way. Like, I became a part of a clan, and I didn't work for another company for 6 years because I just didn't need to, and I didn't want to, because I was able to then really work out what First Nation design was for me. And when we talk about authenticity, it's about knowing that it is yours. And that takes time. You can't just magic that up. And that's why we can't have white fellas doing that stuff, because they just have no idea what they're doing. Like, it's not, they look at it from over here, we look at it from the centre. So we're really lucky, I think, to have places like Bangarra and Stephen and Wes and these leaders to stand up and own that space and be able to go, this is how we do it, this is why we do it. You don't need to get involved in the creative, let us run our path. And that all goes back to that continuation of culture, continuation of story. Moving on to story. Story for me, I think, working, Wes said ceremony before, that's what I think we do. We make ceremony. We don't tell theatre's a Western thing. I don't see what I do and what we do as theatre. It's ceremony. And in ceremony, nothing's singular. You know, we've talked today and everything's sort of broken down, set, costume, props, all of this stuff. It just doesn't exist like that for us. Everything is connected. A song exists to a dance exists to a design exists to a family. It then exists to a place and a person and a dreaming. There's no magical box of things where people exist. We are one thing. And I think...
just quickly, I mean, Jake's talking about what he learnt and what he connected to when he came into Bangarra. For Bangarra to have those cultural creative protocols is because of our relationships. And when we first started, as I said before, we were just all dancers and creators, having this passion to continue traditional forms of dance and to evolve that into a contemporary expression. And so there was a belief and a vision that we all agreed on. What comes with that, though, is if we want to do stories and we want to bring particular traditional dance songs, ideas, and traditional dance into a contemporary discussion, there's a process in that. So, you know, families, cultural protocols, cultural endorsements, talking with families who entrust us with their story because they know that you have a Western mainstream foundation, you know, you have a platform, and so therefore the integrity has to be kept. So there's a whole big creative process. I know you talk about pre-production and post and then performing and then getting the money and then that does that. There's all those things that make, you know, that goes involved in a whole part of telling story. But that's on the outside of the goanna skin. But, you know, the belly inside of to tell a story and to care for a story, most of your time and energy is spent in the focus on that and making sure that's all there. Because if you surrender and you become the 3-year-old child to respect culture at that level and process, then what you're creating, you don't get time to think about. You're just making sure that that spirit's kept and maintained. And so therefore, and then it's passed on to all the people that they're going to be inspired by that. All the artists that were, all the dancers will swallow that story and they'll embody that. And then from that shape of movement will take place. And then what's traditionally motifs to what's contemporary. And then we all feed off each other. And if we all pulse and connect together under that one creative spirit, then really the product speaks for itself. And that's pretty much our tradition all the way through. So even if it's inspired by black politics or abstract or land and ocean and sky or creation story or mythology stories falling into contemporary vision, at Bangarra now I think there's over 40 works and there's a thematic pantry of diverse stories, and this one story Jake's going to talk about now, which is what that beautiful motif symbol is an excerpt from. Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, it's about clan. You know, it's like we do it our way, and that I think that's really important to think about and talk about. And also, you know, a lot of those things may feel like abstract to you who don't maybe aren't Australian, but we are always on country. The stories we tell are always connected to families, and they're connected to place. And us as caretakers of those stories, we have a responsibility to always care for the people, the family, the place, and the country. And this leads on to the work Bennelong. And Wes, I might get you, do you want to do a little rundown on Bennelong?
Bennelong is he's a character, he's a person from the early days of the colonial project in Sydney. He was one of the first Aboriginal people to, in fact, learn English and be the interpreter and interlocutor between both Aboriginal people in the colony who were living in that land and then the colonists. One famous story was the governor, Arthur Phillip, who eventually took Bennelong to London. And a lot of the references to Bennelong there was being a great mimic, a great performer, someone who fit into white society. But when he comes back to Australia, when he was returned to country, was in some respects isolated and sent away from his people. He didn't fit in anymore. People might know where his house was, which is now the site of the Sydney Opera House, which is called Bennelong Point. And he had a cottage there that was first burnt down, and the second one was built, and he lived there. He died from injuries from being beaten in the street, from very drunken behaviours, where he never quite fit in where he came from. This strong Aboriginal man of great talent who was eventually separated from his family, separated from his people, and never found his home again.
Yeah, and Stephen, you talk about this as him being, we are all Bennelongs as First Nation people, and that the challenges that he faced 5 years ago are the same ones that we face today. We might be as early in a colonial project, but we still face the same structure that confines who we are. Stephen choreographed this work and directed it. It was in 2017. And it was a really important work, I think, for us collectively as a company, but I think for us creatively too, because I'd been there for 7 years, and it really just pulled every bit of what we'd been doing together in a way where we just, as Stephen said before, it was in us and it just wanted to be told, and we just made that work. And we didn't think about it because it was so instinctual, and everything we needed to have inside us to know what to do was there. And what I'm going to do now is, there's a picture of him, Bennelong, is talk about the show and talk about, I just want to start talking about design. So we filled you up and sort of the backstory, and this is design. So this ring that's also over there in the exhibition. And I can remember when we have a look at these images, the questions that Stephen asked me. And for me, design is all about questions and concept and ideas. If you don't have an idea, you don't have anything. And Stephen, we were talking about how do we birth this story? What's the core? How do we talk about country? How do we talk about dreaming? And you said to me, what is country without people? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? And so it's such a hugely broad question, but because of our connectedness, our visual and story language that we've grown, you start to go, okay, so we do have elements that we always, in our pantry of, I guess, cultural dilly bag of stuff, we've got smoke, we've also got a circle. And so at the top of the show, this ring appears, and there's a gloss black floor, and it's just sitting there, and it's just building. And then it starts to smoke. And it it asks the question of, if you look back in time into our dreaming, there was this space, and these dancers come out and they birth this story. And it just, I think the reason why I wanted to bring that image here and share it with you is because really it's about identity. We talk about Bennelong being in two worlds and not knowing how he could stand with those 2 feet on his own country anymore. And I think for all of us, If you stand in that room over there and you see your reflection in this space, you ask yourself the question, or you may ask yourself the question of who am I? What is my connection to my home? Who are the First Nation people, if you're not First Nation people, of the place that I am from? And I think, I think it's important to take that conversation over here and put it on, an international stage. And because we all face those questions, I think, all around the world. But from our perspective, we've just been silenced for so long, and this is the conversation that I wanted to bring to PQ.
Can I add to this? Just the cultural significance of smoke is a very important thing to maybe note. That smoke, yes, it can be the sign of fire and destruction, which is not necessarily in Australia the relationship we have with fire, that fire is hardwired into the way that the country works. It's been designed to burn in light ways rather than the hard ways, big hot fires. And smoke is often about cleansing, that this notion of you will go through a smoking ceremony to cleanse yourself, to prepare yourself for other business, to move on to something else. So that smoke's an interesting negotiation too in a theatrical environment. Do you actually make smoke with fire, given that all the fire regulations say you can't, or do you negotiate an innovation of how smoke is made and used, both in its kind of performative and ceremonial purposes? And so again, a First Nations process of negotiating the materiality of smoke that is ephemeral in its very nature, but culturally incredibly rich when you think about a First Nations perspective.
Yeah, so for instance, we were using smoke or we were song or dance. It always comes from a person of knowledge. And I think that's really important. And then it's the trust, and they understand that this is going to go on a trip around the country, and it's like, we know the origins of this smoke. This may not be the smoke from that country, but it's been given the blessing to share that story with audiences.
And also too, I think, First Nations artistic kinship systems globally come with a whole array of ceremonial ingredients, and obviously land and people and story and elements are a huge part of the myriad forms of their kinship system. For song, the calling of the land, to sing on country before you walk onto country. Sometimes you can do that quietly inside. Sometimes it's led by an important songman or woman who will unify all our spirits so that our energy can cross across that particular area. And I think symbolically, this circle of smoke and the dances was really for all of us to feel grounded and pay respect to this Wongal man that is Bennelong. He no longer is with us. He was this mediator between black and white. He gave us an example of how challenging that would be, and still today we have many First Nations mob, contemporary mob from all over the country in different social environments leading the way, having the black lens, having the black voice, who are wonderfully exhausted, breaking down this Commonwealth system. And we're wishing and hoping that we become this republic, this country, that we will have a black First Nations president one day. And this fight and all of the symbolism here is to continue and pay respect to those customs that are just as valuable in our contemporary society today as they were then.
Yeah, it's funny, when we were making this work at some point, actually I think it was post making it, I thought to myself, the stories that we all tell, I hope that we're still telling them in another 250 years. Like we're not writing a play, or we're not making this work. It's not even a work, it's ceremony and putting it on the shelf. This is part of our cultural narrative, that the continuation of culture I was talking about before. Another Bennelong shot. Now, 1788, it's a date, obviously, and it's an important date. Well, I don't know. Wes, do you want to talk about 1788?
1788 is the year that the first fleet arrived in Australia, in Sydney Cove, which started the whole British colonial project. And in many ways is a date that, you know, there are dates before then. The Macassans were doing trade in the north of the country. The Dutch had already arrived. There'd been a whole range of people, but it's the British colonial project in 1788 that marked the beginning, if you like, of the modern experience of being Australian.
Oh, yeah, I guess we should also say that Bennelong was right at the heart of all of that first contact. But the question is, as a designer...
And we were talking about the Wongal Bennelong's people for the first time seeing colonial ships come into the mouth of the harbour of Sydney. And they're all, you know, it's January, late January. They're all on their hunting grounds, great weather, fantastic fishing, the best produce in the world. And then just smelling 6 months of poison coming into the harbour. And we often talk about that. And there's these beautiful stories. Anyway, I'm not going to go into them. Thanks, Jake.
Okay. I mean, excellent segue though, because it's, you go, well, then there is a date, and we do have a date. It's not our date, it doesn't belong to our calendar. And so how do you deal with that visually on stage and make a statement that reowns those numbers in a way where they could be a painter, a symbol, a body? How do you flip them into something else that actually doesn't celebrate what they are as numbers, but they become a symbol in this story?
Lucky you didn't do those numbers instead of the ring. You would have to shrunk them down in that little box. You know, no, I'm joking.
Actually, everyone hits design problems when they get into the theatre, and the numbers were really heavy and they didn't lift off the floor for a while, which was a big problem. But
that's a great kind of story, though, isn't it? Numbers are too heavy and won't get off the floor.
Yeah.
Metaphoric.
And the make of those numbers, it's probably because the story they hold, they were like heavy, they were the worst things to move around, and I thought, they're living up to the character that they
should have been dumped.
I know. Well, that's why they're not like chronological in their order, like it's a dysfunctional system that is still somehow the supremacist and it's eating its own head, and we've all got to put up with the pollution of it.
Yeah. But I think also in all of these images, you know, those are the sort of questions, because we live in this system that we do, that we all have to ask ourselves to find truth. And truth is about, for me, you know why you've made something, and you can step back from it, and you've had 100 versions of this glass in front of you, and you make one, and you go, that is the glass, and I know how I got there, why I got there, and where it's going. And if I believe in it, because I have to believe in it first, then all of you hopefully will too. And that's, I think, when you start to get into authenticity, which I think we all do. And that's when things get really exciting, because you know that you're owning the story for you and the people who the story belong to. And then we like just talking about costuming, I guess, as well too. How do we interpret these historical costumes that don't belong to us in a contemporary form, that they become symbols? You know, they're expressions of that time that let the dancers tell those stories. And this is, I also have, when I design, we all have rules. And one of them for me is that I don't want straight lines. Everything has to be made by your hand. Because if you look back 65,000 years, the greatest tool we had were our hearts and the stories in our minds, and that was perfection. So a straight line is a straight line, but you can feel the marks made by the person who made it. And that goes back to authenticity as well. That talks about style. That talks about who you are, the country you're from. But for this, we were talking about a door. So we started with a circle that smoked, and then halfway through the show we get to this door, and it's the first time you see a straight line, and it's talking about a threshold. It's talking about stepping through this world, well, the world you were from, through a geometric shape into a world that is not yours, and the pain and the problems that go with that.
The confinement and yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because we sort of were inspired by a lot of the Western construct of borders, markings on land, compared to our lines are all the riverbeds that connect each area in our country. Anyway.
Thirsty work, this drinking, talking. Look, all the mediums we use, there can be projection, there can be smoke. We use them because we're a living culture. Just like our ancestors, if some tool came into their lives, they'd work out how it could best help them, help tell them stories, facilitate whatever it is. So we do use projection, and you can see just a little bit of projection in the background there. And again, it's another storytelling tool. We're not, I guess what we do and have done and we all do is there's this beautiful fusion. And when I talk about fusion, it's old knowledge and new technology, or new knowledge and old technology coming together. And it's not about them competing, it's actually about how you decolonise that technology and use it for you, for the story. I think for all of us, it's never about spectacle. Nothing is about spectacle. It's always about the story. And that's the most important thing, because if you forget the story, you forget your purpose. It's a bit, that's sermon. It's a bit serious, but we do laugh quite a lot, like often. And we're getting close to the end. Stephen, the question he asked me for this is, he wanted to talk about the women and the wives. Bendalong had 5 wives, and how do we bring a female shape, and we talk about Sydney Harbour, into this space, and we talk about technology as well. These are real mussel shells that I 3D scanned, and then we printed up, and it talks about real connection to country. You know, we obviously, and scale of course, but it's that idea that place, and we can take, or we're given something and it can appear on stage and it's an exact replica. And I think that that is just such, as a designer and as a First Nations designer, you go, oh, the possibilities there are endless. So I think that is also, I've got to wrap it up in a second. And I just want to talk about this final image, and we talk about, I don't know, the end of Bendalong's life. We built a white box, white on the outside, silver reflection on the inside, and he gets buried in a tomb. And it was constructed by the dancers. Yeah.
Can I say, on seeing that show at the Sydney Opera House, at the site of his death, and to see that final scene was really powerful. This idea that, in fact, you felt spirit come from the ground up into that show. And you talked to Beau about how he inhabited that character and that sense that there's true spirit in it as well.
Yeah, it was that was a really, you got to think about the performance too. When you talk about Beau, he takes on that character, that story for that whole tour. He feels that emotional journey every night for that long. And I guess that goes back to what we do as storytellers.
Yeah, and I think for most of the First Nations artists of today and over the last 34 years, and that's why we make sure they're cared for as artists, because yes, we work with elders who endorse language, you know, the breadth of language to be in the soundtrack. I make sure all the dancers are involved in that conversation as much as we can fulfill them with the knowledge and the respect and all those beautiful cultural ingredients. You know, we do our own little preparation ceremony, and when they're painting up, so there's always ceremony within the ceremony. Yeah, good drag queen name, Ceremony. Sorry. I am delirious. Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to the show tonight, Stephen. No, to wrap up, thank you so much for letting us have this space today. And I thank Wesley and Stephen for joining me in this conversation. And it's been, I hope, really informative, rewarding, inspiring for you, but also for us. We had dinner last night, and I think even though we're in another whole other part of the world, we get to sit down and talk about what we do in our practice.
Yeah, and I think when you uproot from another country and you come and you sit, and I don't know, you just get this other sort of, it's not clear thoughts, but you just have this beautiful passion to keep continuing to wanting to tell stories, because art is the best medicine. And do you reckon that box will ever look like this? No, I'm joking.
A few smoke issues, but we're all good. Thank you very much.